The lights of Las Vegas never sleep. They burn through the desert night like a promise or a warning, calling dreamers, hustlers, and kings without crowns. Two boys from Brooklyn heard that call before the city even had a name worth printing. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the fire, the face, the man who made crime look like champagne and silk. Meyer Lansky, the quiet architect, the man who could make a fortune disappear into ledgers no one could read. Together, they would change the game and pay the price in blood and silence. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. It was a warm night in Beverly Hills, but inside the suite at 810 North Linden Drive, the air didn't move. The windows were open, cracked just enough to let the breeze in, but the curtains hung still, as if even the California wind didn't dare interrupt. The room was quiet, unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in around the walls just before something terrible arrives. Bugsy Siegel stood at the mirror. The lamp on the dresser bathed the room in golden light. One bulb flickered now and then, not enough to notice unless you were watching it. He wasn't. He was watching himself. The jacket was navy, double-breasted, tailored in Rome. His tie was a dark wine silk. Cufflinks, mother of pearl with a chip on the right one he'd never had repaired. His hair, black and perfectly combed, shone with pomade. A thin sheen of sweat traced his temple, just beneath the hairline. Not fear, humidity. He would have told you that. He leaned closer to the glass, adjusted the knot, then smiled. Just a little. Outside, the palm trees whispered. He had always liked this mirror. It was tall and old, not cheap hotel glass, but real crystal, the kind that reflected every flaw, every scar, every line, every success. He liked mirrors. Mirrors told the truth. And Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had spent a lifetime selling lies. He reached for the newspaper folded neatly on the dresser. Los Angeles Times, June 20th, 1947. The ink left the faintest residue on his fingers. Front page, nothing about him. That would change. He tossed the paper aside and sat on the edge of the bed, picking up the white hotel telephone. His fingers hovered over the dial, but he didn't make the call. In another room, someone was breathing heavily. A man named Alan Smiley, reading a magazine, trying not to be in the way. Bugsy hadn't eaten dinner. He didn't like eating late. Said it made the body slow, and slow bodies didn't survive long in his world. Somewhere in the suite, Virginia Hill's perfume still lingered. She had flown to Paris the day before, unannounced. No note, no reason, just gone. He hadn't asked why. He poured himself a glass of scotch. No ice. Sat back down, sipping it slow. This was not a man afraid of dying. But death didn't care. At 10:45 p.m., the window pane exploded inward. The first bullet entered through his cheekbone and exited through the back of his skull, tearing a hole the size of a fist. The next two ripped through his neck and chest. One more slammed into his right eye. The glass behind him shattered, spraying crystal fragments into the carpet like silver shrapnel. Blood sprayed the wall behind him like paint. He didn't scream. He didn't have time. Bugsy Siegel's body collapsed against the dresser. His scotch spilled onto the rug. His reflection was still visible, frozen in the mirror's fractured glass, caught forever in the second before the shot. Alan Smiley, untouched, ran. Downstairs, neighbors called the police. No one chased the shooter. No one confessed. No one ever would. For most, the story begins here. A gangster killed in Hollywood, gunned down behind silk curtains and broken promises. The newspapers ran with it. Flamingo King murdered in Beverly Hills. The Chicago Tribune printed a cartoon, a pink flamingo, riddled with bullet holes, flapping its broken wings above the Vegas Strip. Bugsy Siegel, the man with the movie star smile and a killer's eyes, was now a myth. But myths don't appear fully formed. They are built. One violent moment, one whispered deal, one betrayal at a time. So to understand how a boy from Brooklyn ended up dead in a mansion filled with ghosts, you have to go back, far back, to a different borough, a different decade, and a world already hardening around a boy who refused to be small. Brooklyn, New York. Winter, 1912. A boy stands on a fire escape, breath clouding in the bitter wind. He is 6 years old. His jacket is too thin. his boots too small. His fists are already clenched. The streets below him are cold and wet, the colour of coal smoke and old bread. In Williamsburg, the tenements rise like iron cages, stacked with mothers screaming, fathers gone, and children who never learn softness. His name is Benjamin Siegel. His parents are immigrants from Austria. His father pushes carts. His mother prays. Neither can contain him. He is not a boy meant to listen. He is a boy who will make people listen. He starts young, stealing coal off train cars, running numbers for petty hoods, throwing punches at anyone who calls him Benny. By age 10, he's already known for his temper. By 12, he carries a blade. And by 14, he meets a boy who will change everything. Meyer Lansky. They're opposites. Lansky is quiet, methodical, precise. Bugsy is fire and instinct. Loud, beautiful, unpredictable. But something clicks between them. Not friendship. Something deeper. Trust. Together, they start small, stealing from laundromats, shaking down kids for lunch money. But the world is changing, and fast. Prohibition is coming. With it, opportunity. Bugsy doesn't dream of safety. He dreams of control, of women, power, and above all, respect. And he'll carve it out of the world, one body at a time, if he has to. When police arrived at the house on Linden Drive, they found Bugsy's body still warm. Alan Smiley was in shock. He claimed not to have seen the shooter. No weapon was ever recovered. No suspect ever arrested. Virginia Hill returned days later. She said nothing to the press, just collected her things. The coroner's report noted 4 entry wounds and 1 eye missing. An image that would become legend. The Flamingo Hotel reopened a month later. It turned a profit within weeks. The mob kept it running, under new management. Bugsy's name was never carved into the building's walls, but every tile, every light bulb, every velvet curtain had his fingerprints burned into its foundation. He had turned desert into theatre, blood into glitter. In time, Hollywood softened him. Sinatra called him glamorous. He was portrayed in film by actors with perfect hair and tragic eyes. He became the gangster who dared to dream too big. But beneath the tuxedos and the champagne, Bugsy Siegel was never a dreamer. He was a survivor. And in the end, even survivors can't outrun the math. Too much money missing, too many bosses waiting, too many debts. And someone, somewhere, with a rifle, a window, and a reason. This is where it ends. A mirror, a bullet, a moment. The story of Bugsy Siegel does not begin with death, but it must begin here. Because from this stillness, this glass shattered into silence, we begin to understand what he was chasing all along. Not power, not money, but permanence. And in death, perhaps he found it. Because the desert still glows, the lights still burn, and somewhere behind them, his ghost smiles back. They called it the old neighborhood, but there was nothing nostalgic about it. In 1906, Brooklyn didn't glitter. It clanged. It groaned. It coughed smoke and clattered with carts, boots, and the bark of butcher boys wheeling pails of blood. Williamsburg was a mosaic of languages and stifled ambitions, where factory whistles broke the morning silence and the East River carried the scent of rust and boiled cabbage. Benjamin Siegel was born into that, into the 4th floor of a tenement near South 5th Street, where the wallpaper peeled like scabs and the pipes rattled like bones in winter. His parents were Austrian Jewish immigrants, who brought with them little more than bitter memories of pogroms and a deep, exhausted silence. His mother kept the place clean with rags and vinegar. His father never spoke unless to shout. When he drank, he hit. Even as a toddler, Ben was restless, the kind of child who knocked over the salt, smiled at the mess, and dared you to stop him. He didn't cry when punished. He didn't shrink from fists. He looked back. They say kids like him either disappear into the system or rewrite it. Ben chose the latter. But first, he learned the streets. The alley behind the tenement became his first classroom. There, he learned that strength meant survival, and silence meant you got your shoe shine money stolen. Fists weren't about violence. They were about punctuation. He fought early, often, and with no concern for fairness. And when he wasn't fighting, he was watching. The grown men on stoops with brass rings and switchblades. The women in shawls who ran numbers for the neighborhood boss. The old men who knew when to look away. School never stood a chance. Teachers called him unruly, unteachable, dangerous. But there was something else too, a spark that didn't quite fit their reports. Ben could read people like windows. He knew who was bluffing, who was scared, who needed hurting, and more importantly, he knew how to make people feel seen, even if only for a moment. By the time he turned 10, he was already bringing home more money than his father. Not legally, not cleanly, but certainly with more pride. He shined shoes with a sneer and a razor in his sock. He stole bread and split it with kids who followed him around like a prince. He ran errands for local gamblers and kept his mouth shut. Fast, clever, magnetic, dangerous. It was around that time that he met Meyer. Meyer Lansky was quiet, sharp, and wary of everyone. Where Ben ran headfirst into chaos, Meyer studied it. The two met outside a pool hall near Havermeyer Street. Ben had just slugged a boy twice his size for calling him a name he didn't like. Meyer watched, said nothing. But the next time they met, it was Meyer who offered a deal. They would work together. Meyer would handle the numbers. Ben would handle the problems. And so they did. By 1918, the pair were inseparable. They started small, selling stolen newspapers on corners, running messages for bookmakers, pocketing coins from drunk soldiers who stumbled off the ferry. They called themselves the Bug and Meyer Mob, though no one had given them the name. They simply declared it. And that declaration, like most things Ben did, stuck. It was Meyer who first called him Bugsy, not out of affection, out of warning. "You get that look in your eye sometimes," he said. "Like you're not here anymore, like something's buzzing in your head." Ben smiled. "And don't stand so close." Bootlegging was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. When the Volstead Act passed in 1920, a whole city went dry. But not Williamsburg. Not for those who knew how to slip between cracks. The boys weren't old enough to shave, but they were already moving crates of Canadian whiskey across rooftops and through laundromats. Every drop sold was $1 gained. Every dollar was a step closer to power. Ben didn't drink. That surprised people. But he said alcohol made men stupid, and he wanted to stay dangerous. What he did indulge in was style. He bought his first real suit at 15. Double-breasted, too big, paid for in crumpled bills and blood money. He wore it to a funeral for a rival who tried to muscle in on their territory. The jacket was a statement, not of mourning, of a rival. The violence escalated with their reputation. Ben was known to beat a man unconscious with a lead pipe, then tip his hat to the victim's mother. He wasn't cruel for the sake of it. He was cruel because it worked. Fear, he understood early, was cheaper than loyalty and twice as reliable. But there were lines even he wouldn't cross. He didn't touch women, didn't take from the poor. He had rules, and in a world with none, that made him almost noble. Cops knew his name by 17. Judges rolled their eyes when they saw his face. But charges slipped, witnesses vanished. His alibis were always tight, even when everyone knew they were fiction. Meyer handled the logistics. Ben handled the persuasion. Their network expanded. Little gangs folded under them or disappeared. They earned the attention of older players. Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello. Men who saw potential not just in the brutality, but in the precision. The boys from Brooklyn were becoming something more. Ben never forgot where he came from, but he also never intended to stay there. Poverty, to him, was not romantic. It was a wound that healed badly, always aching. Every dollar he earned was a brick in the wall between himself and that old tenement. And every time he beat a man who underestimated him, he wasn't just punishing a rival, he was punishing the world that once made him small. In back rooms and alleyways, in smoke-filled pool halls and silent basements, the name Bugsy Siegel began to mean something. Not just trouble, not just fire, but inevitability. He was no longer a boy, he was a force, and Brooklyn had taught him everything he needed to know to become one. He was 20 when he walked into his first kill with the same expression he wore walking into a barbershop. Calm, casual, maybe even amused. It was late spring, 1921. A sweltering haze hung over the Lower East Side like a sheet soaked in whiskey and sweat. The city smelled of wet garbage, gasoline, and bad decisions. Bugsy Siegel, in a crisp beige suit and dark gloves, crossed Delancey Street like he owned the pavement. Behind his left ear, a whisper of cologne. In his right coat pocket, a .32 caliber pistol with a pearl handle and no serial number. The man he was after had skipped on a shipment, 20 crates of bootlegged scotch meant for a warehouse in Red Hook. It wasn't the loss that bothered Lansky. It was the message. Weakness was never affordable. Not in this business, and never in those years, when everything depended on the illusion of total control. Siegel didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He opened the door, walked down a hallway that smelled of boiled onions and pipe smoke, and found the man at the kitchen table, halfway through a roast beef sandwich. The man looked up, confused. Bugsy pulled the trigger once. The bullet entered clean through the forehead. The man slumped forward into the bread. Bugsy took the second half of the sandwich and walked out chewing. The neighborhood heard the shot, but didn't report it. They knew the rules. They had just seen them rewritten. Siegel never referred to himself as a killer. He didn't brag, but neither did he flinch. There was a code in those early years, unwritten but absolute. Fear had to arrive faster than doubt. And Bugsy, for all his charm and smooth-talking glamour, never let fear hesitate. By the mid-1920s, he was Lansky's blade. Where Meyer plotted, Bugsy executed, literally. Small-time racketeers who refused to cooperate vanished. Union men who tried to muscle into territory wound up in trunks in Newark. Truck drivers went missing. Barkeeps found dynamite wired under their booths. He didn't kill out of impulse. He killed because he saw it as necessary. Violence wasn't madness. It was method. The press called him erratic. The boys on the street called him electric. But those who met him up close, who looked into his eyes before a decision had been made, called him something else entirely. They called him the End. He wasn't big in size. About 5'8", lean, always tailored to perfection. But what he lacked in physical presence, he compensated for in force of will. That and the unpredictability. You never knew what mood you'd catch him in. Sometimes a laugh, sometimes a knife, and sometimes both. Lansky kept the books, but Bugsy kept the streets. They operated with a ruthless elegance, striking deals with bigger names, carving out territories with violence and finesse. Together, they were rising in the underworld at a speed that felt impossible, even to the veterans who'd earned their way up over blood and broken promises. By 1927, they had earned the attention of Charles "Lucky" Luciano. And Lucky had plans. The idea was simple in structure, but revolutionary in scale. A unified national crime syndicate. Instead of competing mobs waging war in back alleys, they would operate as a coalition, Italian, Jewish, Irish, bound by profit, fear, and the elimination of chaos. For that, Luciano needed soldiers he could trust. Bugsy was one of the first calls. He wasn't Italian, and that mattered, but not enough to stop Lucky from recruiting him. Luciano needed someone who could enforce decisions, who could move fast, keep quiet, and not ask questions. Bugsy became his man in Manhattan. A soldier, yes, but more than that. A symbol. Proof that brutality, when worn with silk gloves and a smile, could change the game entirely. The murder list began to stretch. Names disappeared from city directories. Sometimes it was rivals, sometimes it was insiders, informants, traitors, problem solvers who had solved one problem too many. Bugsy's role in the rise of Murder, Inc., the syndicate's enforcement wing, was unspoken but understood. He didn't just kill, he coordinated. He enforced silence across the boroughs like a conductor guiding a symphony. A man named Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, once tried to intimidate him during a meeting in a Harlem nightclub. Bugsy listened, nodded, smiled, then excused himself. The next night, the windows of Dutch's best restaurant were shattered with shotgun blasts. No one died, but every table was overturned, every glass broken. It wasn't a warning, it was a message. The next time Dutch and Bugsy met, Schultz offered him a cigar. But Bugsy wasn't content with being a footnote in someone else's empire. He liked the money, sure, but he liked the respect more. He dressed in cashmere, drove custom sedans, and kept his hair slicked with pomade imported from France. He lit his cigarettes with gold lighters. He tipped doormen $20 bills just to open the car door a second faster. Women followed him. Men stepped aside. He moved between high society and street corners like he belonged in both. Because, in a way, he did. At the Waldorf Astoria, he was a guest. In Hell's Kitchen, he was a legend. In Midtown, you toasted his name. In the Bronx, you whispered it. With every bullet fired, every rival erased, something inside him began to shift. He had always been volatile, quick to anger, quicker to strike. But now the rage came unprovoked. Sometimes it was an insult, other times just a look. There were stories, of him throwing a crystal ashtray at a man's face for talking too loud, of beating a cab driver unconscious for taking the wrong turn, of pistol whipping a bartender until the blood pooled under the scotch bottles. Lansky watched it happen, watched his oldest friend drift closer to the edge. Bugsy didn't care. He was chasing something else, something bigger than fear, bigger than money. He didn't just want power, he wanted immortality. The 1930s brought the full bloom of Prohibition's promise. With Luciano's syndicate in place and the bootlegging empire thriving coast to coast, Bugsy expanded his role. He set up distribution rings from Jersey to Chicago. He laundered money through trucking unions and speakeasies. He moved guns, girls, protection rackets, and smuggled shipments through ports that answered to no one but a folded bill and a silent nod. And still, he walked the streets like he owned them, as if the night itself parted for him. No bodyguards, no fear, just a Browning under his jacket and the confidence of a man who had never once imagined dying. But there was something else about him, a charm that was dangerous, because it made people forget how deadly he was. He could sit with a man for 20 minutes, ask about his family, make him laugh, order him a steak, and then, with no shift in tone, remind him what would happen if the next shipment came light. He smiled while doing it, not out of cruelty, out of principle. His logic was simple. If you're going to threaten a man's life, at least let him enjoy the meal. Yet, despite his reputation, or maybe because of it, Bugsy never lacked invitations. He moved through New York society with the ease of someone born to it, even if his birth had been soaked in poverty and blood. He dined with politicians, financed nightclubs, shared drinks with jazz musicians. To the outside world, he was something new, a gangster who looked like a movie star, spoke like a businessman, and killed like a soldier. But inside, the lines were blurring. The violence no longer followed the logic it once had. Sometimes he'd take a job because it was needed, sometimes because he was asked, sometimes because he was bored. And boredom, in his world, was lethal. By 1935, the NYPD had files on at least 16 suspected murders tied to Bugsy Siegel. Not one charge stuck. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, judges were paid, or scared, or both. He walked free every time, brushing invisible lint from his shoulder, as reporters shouted questions he never answered. "Mr. Siegel, did you know the victim? Mr. Siegel, where were you last night?" He would pause, smile, then keep walking, as if the sidewalk itself owed him a favor. But with visibility came risk. And the more the public saw him, the more headlines his name gathered, the more attention he drew from the syndicate's old guard. Lansky warned him, "Keep your head down." Bugsy nodded and ordered champagne. Lucky warned him, "Don't play both sides." Bugsy agreed and sent roses to a prosecutor's wife. He was balancing too many lives. The killer, the businessman, the celebrity. And the cracks were beginning to show. One night in late 1936, a body turned up in a Queens alley, half buried in trash, shot 3 times. No ID. Cops found a matchbook in the dead man's pocket, from a club Bugsy part-owned. When they asked him about it, Bugsy laughed. "That's a cheap club," he said. "I wouldn't bury a dog behind it." They didn't charge him, but they started watching closer. And still, he kept moving. Blood on his hands, silk on his back. He told a girl once, over drinks at the Stork Club, that he hated the word gangster. He said it like it tasted wrong. "I'm not a gangster," he said. "I'm a businessman with teeth." She laughed. He didn't. The sidewalk had carried him far, from Williamsburg gutters to Manhattan penthouses. But the stains on it followed, and he was running out of room to walk. The first time Bugsy Siegel stepped onto Sunset Boulevard, it was 1937. He drove a black Packard with white wall tires and a license plate from New York that he refused to change. He had on a grey linen suit, a white silk shirt, and a pink tie, knotted just loose enough to suggest ease, but not weakness. His shoes shone brighter than the pavement. There was a .38 revolver tucked into the glove box and a pair of silver-rimmed sunglasses on his face. He was 31 and humming a song no one else could hear. The California air tasted different, sweeter, softer, not like Brooklyn's metal and steam. This was the kind of air that let a man breathe in ambition and blow out gold dust. Bugsy had been sent west to expand the syndicate's reach, open the city, tame it, squeeze it. But the moment he arrived, he decided he wasn't there to follow orders. He was there to rule it. Los Angeles, in the late 30s, was a city between realities, part dream, part danger. There were still orange groves in the valley and rattlesnakes in the canyons, but downtown already pulsed with neon and jazz. The studios lit the hills like bonfires. Nightclubs pulsed with gin, violins, and the scent of perfume so sharp it made your teeth ache. Hollywood wasn't a city, it was a mirage with a payroll, and Bugsy Siegel loved it. Not just the weather or the palms or the blondes, but the performance of it all. Here, even crime dressed better. Men talked in scripts, women moved like illusions. Everyone was pretending to be something they weren't. Bugsy didn't pretend. He was blood and polish, in equal measure. He took a suite at the Waldorf Astoria on Sunset and paid in cash. He tipped the bellhop $20 just for calling him Sir. He bought champagne by the crate and had it chilled in tubs of ice carried in from the Beverly Hills Hotel. Within a week, he was seen dining with George Raft, who knew him from back east. Within 2, he was on studio lots, shaking hands with producers, laughing with script girls. He wore double-breasted suits with silk lapels and kept a pocket square folded sharp as a razor. In Los Angeles, people called him Mr. Siegel. They didn't yet know why. It wasn't all parties. Bugsy had business. The syndicate wanted numbers, the racetracks, the wire services, the casinos that lined the desert border towns. Bugsy wanted something more. He wanted a kingdom, and he knew kingdoms didn't run on force. They ran on image. He started by buying into clubs, the Clover Club on Sunset, the Trocadero, the Formosa, places where the stars drank and the deals were whispered. Then he started owning the people inside them, waiters, bartenders, hosts, dancers, pit bosses, anyone who saw things, anyone who could be leaned on. He also bought the cops. It didn't take much. A few grand here, a few envelopes there. In Los Angeles, corruption was as common as smog. But it was a different kind of game. East Coast power was hard-edged, earned through blood, structured by family, enforced by silence. Out west, it was a free-for-all of studios, sheriffs, and scandal. Bugsy adapted. He didn't try to recreate New York. He created something new, a lifestyle. And then came Virginia Hill. She was like a gunshot in a silk glove. Red hair, laughter like broken glass, a temper that didn't blink. She had grown up in Alabama, but clawed her way into the inner circles of Chicago's underworld, sleeping with bookies, learning every con, every ledger, every escape route. They met at a party in the hills, a rented mansion with a view of the city that looked like it had been dipped in firelight. Bugsy walked in wearing a white suit and a gold watch. Virginia was leaning against the bar, arguing with a producer twice her age and half her speed. They saw each other before they spoke. It wasn't romance, it was recognition. He offered her a drink. She told him she poured her own. He laughed. She didn't. He followed her home. They didn't stop seeing each other for nearly a decade. Their relationship was volcanic. There were fights that cracked walls, screams that neighbors swore sounded like dying animals, furniture thrown, lamps shattered. But there were also nights on patios under the moonlight, drinking French wine and planning empires. They were both chasing something bigger than themselves. Virginia didn't want to be someone's girl. She wanted her own legend. Bugsy promised her one. Together, they became a story that wrote itself. He made friends with studio heads. Let his picture be taken with Clark Gable, Carol Lombard, Cary Grant. He hosted parties that people still talk about in whispers. Cigars hand-rolled on thighs, orchestras flown in from Havana, caviar served in marble bathtubs. But behind it all, the money moved. He built a crew in LA, a mix of East Coast imports and local muscle. He kept them loyal with cash and terrified with what they'd seen him do. He ran protection for film sets, skimmed from the union dues, oversaw heroin shipments through the port of Long Beach. He owned pieces of betting parlors from Ventura to Tijuana. No one could prove a thing. The studios didn't ask, and the cops didn't want to know. But there were cracks. The press had started sniffing around, columnists who thought it was cute to connect a known killer to a leading lady. There was a write-up in the Los Angeles Times that referred to him as handsome and homicidal. Bugsy framed it. But the attention made Lansky nervous. Luciano, too. They liked the money Bugsy made. They didn't like the spotlight he invited. Back in New York, they were trying to stay invisible. Out in Hollywood, Bugsy was making crime look like celebrity. That was dangerous. Still, he pushed. He got involved with the Continental Press Service, a wire operation that fed race results to bookies across the country. By controlling the speed of the feed, Bugsy could manipulate odds, fix results, and skim millions. It was brilliant, and it made enemies. Rival outfits in Chicago, Kansas City, and Detroit all had a stake in the same wire networks. When Bugsy muscled in, he did it without asking. There were sit-downs, heated calls, a car bomb in Glendale that killed the wrong man. But Bugsy wouldn't back down. "You want the coast?" he said once. "Come and take it." No one did. By 1941, he was rich beyond anything he'd imagined in Brooklyn. But money was never the goal. Control was. He wanted to build something that would outlive him, something permanent. And to do that, he needed more than Los Angeles. He needed Vegas. That dream was still just a flicker, an idea he would carry with him like a flame in the palm of his hand. But for now, he was content to rule a kingdom of light and shadows, to eat breakfast with starlets and dinner with killers, to walk into nightclubs where the music stopped when he entered, to kiss Virginia Hill like he didn't care who was watching, to leave blood on the back steps and still sit front row at the Academy Awards. Bugsy Siegel didn't just enter Hollywood, he absorbed it. He turned crime into performance, turned violence into style. He was the dream and the threat, all in one. And though he didn't know it yet, the city he thought he'd conquered was already writing the final scene. He stepped out of the car and looked across the Mojave like it owed him something. It was 1945. The war was ending, the country was changing, and Benjamin Siegel stood at the edge of the Nevada desert wearing a cream linen suit and Italian leather shoes, his hands in his pockets, the sun glaring off his sunglasses like searchlights. There was nothing in front of him, just dirt, heat, and miles of empty space. But what he saw wasn't emptiness. He saw a kingdom. Bugsy Siegel was not a man built for limits. The cities he'd passed through, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, had all tried to contain him. They had alleys and rules and people who whispered behind curtains. But this place, this stretch of sand and silence, had no ceiling. And that's what he wanted. He turned to the men beside him, an architect, a contractor, a lawyer who didn't blink much, and pointed to the open land. "Right there," he said. "We'll build the finest hotel this country's ever seen. Marble floors, glass walls, gambling tables bigger than church altars. The works." Someone laughed. Bugsy didn't. Las Vegas in 1945 was a stopover, a pit stop for gamblers too broke to make it to California. There were a few joints off Fremont Street, small-time casinos, desert bars, truck stops. Nothing that shined, nothing that lasted. But the state had legalized gambling, and the air was ripe with opportunity. Bugsy saw past the brothels and slot machines. He saw Rome, he saw Cairo, he saw the Riviera, only bigger, gaudier, more American. He returned to Los Angeles and started making calls. He needed money, a lot of it. He pitched the Flamingo Hotel not as a mob venture, but as a business opportunity. The first luxury casino in Nevada, spa, restaurant, showroom, suites, gardens. A desert Eden for millionaires and movie stars. He promised it would make them all rich. He promised it would be clean, elegant, safe. He called in debts from the syndicate, made visits to New York and Chicago, sat down with men who didn't smile, passed envelopes to those who didn't ask questions. Soon, the money started to flow. $5 million, then 7, then more. Bugsy gave the Flamingo its name not for flash, but for Virginia Hill, who loved the bird, the way it stood tall and alone. He imagined the pink neon glowing above the desert like a crown. But dreams don't build themselves. The land was swampy. The foundations sank. Trucks got stuck in the sand. Supplies were delayed. Contractors lied. Costs ballooned. Bugsy, who once solved problems with a glance or a gun, now found himself knee-deep in concrete and red ink. Still, he pushed forward. Ordered imported tile from Italy. Chandeliers from France. Hired top designers from Beverly Hills. He wanted everything perfect. The carpet, the doorknobs, even the ice buckets. He paced the unfinished floors like a man inspecting his own palace before the coronation. But behind the scenes, patience wore thin. Back in New York, Lansky was watching. So was Luciano, still calling shots from exile in Italy. The syndicate bosses had expected a quick flip, build a small hotel, skim the profits, wash the cash. Instead, they had a money pit. The budget, originally set at $1.5 million, had doubled, then tripled. No one could trace where it all went. There were whispers. Bugsy was skimming. Bugsy was paying off friends. Bugsy was losing touch. They began sending men to check on things. Quiet men, observers, accountants. Bugsy greeted them with charm, tours, bottles of whiskey. Then he went back to the plans and ordered another marble fountain. By mid-1946, the Flamingo was still unfinished. The shell stood, but the insides were chaos. Workers quit, payments missed, deadlines collapsed. Virginia Hill, who had once stood beside him with fire in her eyes, now slammed doors and vanished for weeks at a time. They argued over everything, the lighting, the drapes, the silence between them. And Bugsy changed. The confidence, still there, began to twitch. His temper, always sharp, now burned fast. He slapped a foreman for ordering the wrong wallpaper, threw a wrench at a valet who scratched a car. He drank more, slept less. But when he stood into the Flamingo at night, in the silence, he saw only victory. He would say to no one in particular, "It's all going to work, they'll see." The opening was set for December 26, 1946. He rushed to finish everything. Furniture delivered by train, chefs flown in from New York, musicians contracted for opening night. He invited stars, politicians, writers. The guest list read like a dream. But outside, the rain started falling. It was rare for Las Vegas, but it came hard. The newly paved parking lot turned to mush. The plumbing wasn't finished. Half the kitchen didn't work. Some rooms had no beds. The neon flickered like it wasn't sure it belonged. Still, the doors opened. The Flamingo was live. And it was a disaster. Most of the invited guests never came. Those who did left early. The casino lost money. The bar ran out of whiskey. Reporters mocked the chaos in the papers. One wrote, "Bugsy Siegel's bird can't fly." Back in New York, the syndicate took note. They began whispering behind closed doors. About losses, about trust, about removal. Bugsy insisted it was a glitch. He closed the hotel, ordered renovations, told everyone he'd reopen in spring. He needed time, just a little more time. He promised the money would come. He told Meyer over the phone, "This is it, May. This is the big one. They just don't see it yet." But Lansky was tired of promises, and the bosses were tired of being embarrassed. Still, the money kept bleeding. Investigators began circling. A grand jury in Los Angeles subpoenaed records. The IRS knocked. The FBI poked. Virginia Hill left for Switzerland. Then Paris. Bugsy told people she was just taking a break. Others said she was running. She never called. And in the silence, he unraveled. He punched a mirror in his suite, broke his hand, cursed the hotel walls, fired the kitchen staff, rehired them the next day, sat in the empty casino at night, staring at the slot machines like they might offer forgiveness. The dream had become something else, not an empire, a mausoleum. In May of 1947, the Flamingo finally began to turn a profit. A slim one, but real. Guests returned. Gamblers filled the tables. The lights stayed on. Bugsy sent word to the bosses. "Told you. I told you it would work." He poured himself a drink, lit a cigarette, waited for the applause. None came. Instead, the conversations behind the curtain got louder. They'd given him time. They'd given him money. Now they would give him something else. Bugsy Siegel built his dream in the dust. But in doing so, he walked away from everything that had once kept him alive. The rules, the network, the discipline of the syndicate. He bet it all on vision, on marble and mirrors, on pink lights and glass doors. And the desert, for all its beauty, has never been kind to gamblers who go alone. On December 26, 1946, the doors opened. The desert night hung still and cold over Highway 91, the road that would one day become the Las Vegas Strip. Wind stirred the neon letters spelling Flamingo across a glowing pink sign that flickered like a promise it couldn't quite keep. Below it, a half-finished casino shimmered under floodlights and hope. Outside, valets in white tuxedos waited with stiff hands. Inside, the carpet hadn't arrived. The plaster was still drying. The cashier's cages were only half built. Benjamin Siegel stood in the lobby wearing a white double-breasted suit with a rose-colored handkerchief tucked sharp in his pocket. His hair was perfect. His shoes shined. Behind him, a glass entrance framed the emptiness beyond. Miles of desert that was supposed to become his empire. But tonight, they were just dust. Inside the Flamingo, the cocktail waitresses wore satin. The dealers stood behind felt tables in crisp uniforms. There were chandeliers, but not enough of them. The power had cut out twice before guests even arrived. The kitchen was only running half its stoves, and the heat, it worked only when it felt like it. Still, the music played, and Bugsy, ever the showman, smiled. The guests, those who came, trickled in. A few from Los Angeles, a few from the East, a handful of reporters, a few low-tier celebrities. Virginia Hill didn't show. Siegel walked the floor, shaking hands, offering drinks, brushing away apologies from staff with cold eyes and a tighter smile. His dream was alive, barely, but no one could say he didn't open the doors. By midnight, the bar had run out of good scotch. The casino was quiet, painfully so. The roulette wheels spun for no one. Slots jingled with effort, but no payout. The blackjack tables had maybe 3 players, all locals, all bored. A couple of them wore jeans. Bugsy noticed. He lit a cigarette and walked back to his private office. On the desk were stacks of invoices and a bottle of whiskey he didn't touch. He stared at the wall, not at the mirror. The flamingo was open. That had been the goal. But the applause he'd imagined, the thunder of success, wasn't coming. Not tonight. Outside, the wind kicked up. It blew sand through the parking lot, onto chrome bumpers, and into corners where the money had never reached. The next morning, the papers were brutal. Bugsy's bird can't fly. Hollywood gangster gambles and loses. Flamingo grand opening sputters in desert wind. The syndicate read them over breakfast in New York, Chicago, and Havana. They didn't laugh. Bugsy called Lansky. It was just bad luck, May. Rain, power, timing. We'll close it, finish the job right, open again. Bigger. There was a pause. Lansky's voice came through the line flat. You've got one more shot. Bugsy nodded, though there was no one to see it. We'll get there. He hung up, and threw the receiver at the wall. He closed the Flamingo for renovations. Told the press it had always been the plan. Hired new contractors, replaced the head of security, flew in a French chef, bought more slot machines, better chairs, thicker rugs. He ordered a new piano for the lounge, recarpeted the main hallway twice, made the chandeliers bigger, the bar brighter, the vault stronger. But with each change came more money, and more questions. Where was the cash going? Why were costs still climbing? Why were the books impossible to balance? Bugsy refused to explain. He said the Flamingo would pay for itself, said it would be legendary. He didn't know how many had already decided it wouldn't be his legend. By February 1947, the Flamingo reopened. The improvements helped. The casino felt warmer, the crowd thicker, the games louder. Money began to flow, but slowly, like water through a rusted pipe. Enough to hint at potential, not enough to calm nerves. Bugsy paced the floor like a king, inspecting a wounded army. He shook hands with high rollers, barked at croupiers, whispered to waitresses. At night, he lay in the penthouse staring at the ceiling, hearing only the echo of unreturned calls. Virginia was still in Europe. She sent a postcard from Geneva. The air's clean here, it said. No signature. The numbers didn't lie. The Flamingo was bleeding. Every week brought a new memo, a new debt, a new letter from New York that went unanswered. Luciano, still in exile, sent word through intermediaries. Chicago hinted at a shift in management. Lansky stopped returning calls. Bugsy kept smiling. He wore suits in brighter colors, told jokes to anyone who'd listen, threw more money into the floor shows, booked bigger acts. He gave interviews to reporters who already had their headlines written. But the charm began to crack. He slapped a pit boss in front of customers, fired the head of maintenance over a broken water pipe, screamed at a floor manager for laughing too loudly during a losing hand. The employees began to whisper. They started calling the Flamingo the Tomb. One night, a courier from Chicago arrived. A young man, clean-shaven, nervous. He handed Bugsy a sealed envelope and walked out without saying a word. Bugsy didn't open it. He tossed it into the fireplace and lit a match. The paper burned fast. He watched the flames, eyes still and unreadable. The Flamingo made money in March. Not a lot, not enough, but some. Bugsy sent a letter to Lansky. We're turning a corner. Don't listen to the garbage. It's working. There was no reply. April passed. Then May. The money came in like a dying breath. Enough to stay alive. Not enough to live. The bosses waited. The question wasn't if anymore. It was when. In Los Angeles, Bugsy returned to the mansion on North Linden Drive. He started spending more time there. long walks through empty rooms, even longer silences. He watched the trees from the back patio and muttered numbers no one understood. He still believed. The dream hadn't faded for him. He still saw the future in flashing lights and linen drapes. He still thought he could fix it. But it wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the men who had paid for it, and they wanted a return. On June 10, 1947, Lansky met with two men in Havana. The conversation was short, professional. An agreement was reached. The syndicate couldn't afford any more headlines. The Flamingo would survive. Bugsy Siegel would not. The order was clean. It wasn't personal. It was business. 10 days later, Bugsy sat in the living room of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion. She was in Paris. The house was quiet. He read the paper, the Los Angeles Times, had a scotch, didn't finish it. Then came the sound, glass shattering, bullets, and then nothing. The sun was starting to drop behind the palms that lined North Linden Drive, casting long, elegant shadows across Beverly Hills. The house at 810 was quiet, tucked behind hedges, perched just high enough to pretend it belonged to someone gentler than a gangster. Inside, Benjamin Siegel sat in the front room with the windows open and the Los Angeles Times folded neatly in his lap. He hadn't touched the scotch beside him. The ice had melted into the amber 2 hours ago. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't talking. He was reading, slowly, carefully, as if somewhere between the society columns and the sports pages, there was a version of his life that made sense. Outside, the sky dimmed, the world exhaled, and then it shattered. The bullets came fast. Precision cuts through glass. The first round took him through the cheek, a clean shot that exited behind his right ear. He didn't scream, didn't fall immediately. The second burst hit him in the neck and chest, knocking him backward off the chair, twisting his body against the tiled floor. A final shot struck the bridge of his nose, exploding his left eye into the curtain behind him. The glass window cracked in a spiderweb pattern, flecks of it catching the lamplight like diamonds. Blood arced across the wall in a clean fan. The newspaper slid off his lap and landed face up on the floor, the weather report staring blankly at the room. Alan Smiley, Bugsy's friend and guest that night, had been sitting just 10 feet away on a couch near the hallway. The glass hadn't touched him. Neither had the bullets. He stood frozen for 10 seconds, then 30, then moved only to call for help, his voice hollow. Bugsy Siegel was dead, a dreamer who built a palace in the desert, a soldier who once tore through New York with a pipe in one hand and a rolled-up contract in the other, a man who wanted to leave a legacy behind him in neon and music and imported marble. Gone. The police arrived quickly. By then, the street was already drawing a crowd. Neighbors who never admitted they knew who lived there now stood in bathrobes on their driveways, whispering. A few reporters had gotten wind. The mansion had become a stage, and the man who built the scene, who had always imagined the world as something he could design, decorate, and control, lay broken beneath a shattered window, with his tie askew and one shoe off. A detective stepped through the room and winced at the body. Jesus Christ, he muttered. The headlines didn't wait for the coroner. Bugsy Siegel murdered in Beverly Hills. Flamingo boss gunned down in Virginia Hill's home. Gangster's past finally catches up. They used his nickname again, one he hated, one he never could shake. Bugsy. He had spent years trying to outrun that name, insisting people call him Ben or Mr. Siegel. But when the bullets landed, the papers went back to the beginning. A gangster, a thug, a body with a past and a headline. No one was arrested. No one questioned for long. The detectives followed the routine, took statements, bagged shells, filed reports. But everyone already knew what this was. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no witnesses who mattered. Just blood, glass, and silence. Virginia Hill returned a few days later. She didn't cry. She didn't speak to the press. She collected her things, spoke to no one, and boarded a plane back to Paris. People said she knew, said she had been warned, said her leaving was a signal. She never confirmed anything. And the room where Bugsy had died was cleaned and repainted within the week. Back in Las Vegas, the Flamingo stayed open. The floors were mopped. The cash was counted. The new management, flown in quietly from New York, didn't wear flashy suits or throw champagne parties. They got the place profitable. Within 3 months, the casino was turning a steady income. Within a year, it was one of the most visited destinations in the West. No plaque marked the marble that Bugsy had chosen. No picture of him hung behind the bar he designed. No mention of his name could be found in any official paperwork. But everyone knew. The mob never claimed credit. No family stepped forward to say they gave the order. But the message was clear. The syndicate believed in loyalty. They also believed in limits. Bugsy Siegel had crossed too many, cost too much, made too many promises. And in the end, his dream was not enough to protect him. To the world, he became a parable. The gangster who flew too close to Hollywood. The thug who tried to build Rome in the desert. A man who believed in mirrors and glass towers, and died with a newspaper in his lap, and his vision turned inward. But those who knew him, really knew him, remembered more than the blood. They remembered a kid from Brooklyn who fought for respect when all he had was fists. They remembered a man who could charm a room full of enemies and leave with their money. They remembered how he saw the future, how he looked across sand and saw an empire. And they remembered how in the end he kept showing up, kept pushing, kept building, even when the doors wouldn't open, even when no one believed, even when he stood alone beneath a chandelier still missing half its crystals. Benjamin Siegel was buried at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The funeral was private. Few came, fewer spoke. His headstone was simple. Benjamin Siegel, 1906 to 1947. No mention of casinos, no mention of the syndicate, no flowers from Lansky, no note from Luciano. Just a quiet plot under a tree, and a shadow that stretched from Brooklyn to Beverly Hills. Today, the Flamingo still stands, renovated, reimagined. The carpet's been changed, the slot machines replaced. But the bones, the foundation, still hold his fingerprints. The dream still lives. The lights still flicker pink in the Nevada dark. And if you walk through the lobby late at night, past the velvet ropes and the glass doors, you can almost feel it. The echo of a man who wanted more. The memory of someone who believed too much. And the silence that followed the shatter. The train that carried Meyer Lansky to America groaned with hunger. He was barely 5 when his mother wrapped him in wool and lifted him across the threshold of a third-class cabin, leaving Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, now Belarus, a place haunted by the sound of boots and broken glass. They left behind a life no longer survivable. Pogroms swept through Jewish neighborhoods like brushfire. Synagogues were torched. Names disappeared. Dignity was not an option. The family arrived through Ellis Island in 1911 with a single suitcase and no English. The skyline of Manhattan, blurred by steam and fear, welcomed them with cold hands. They settled in the Lower East Side. And from the beginning, Meyer knew. Survival came not from fists, but from knowing where they'd land before they did. He was small, always small. A wiry frame, soft voice, sharp eyes. His classmates called him Shrimp. His teachers, bright but stubborn. He called himself invisible. That was the point. While other boys fought in the alleyways for scraps of bread or corners to shine shoes, Meyer stood quietly, watching. He studied how money moved, how one butcher owed another, how one grocer could trade favors and pay no cash. He learned that power wasn't just in violence, it was in information. He studied mathematics like it was a secret language only he could hear, and the world, slowly, began to whisper back. By the time he was a teenager, Meyer had already begun running errands for local gamblers. He'd deliver slips, record bets, and sometimes take them himself. His reputation grew not through threats or bravado, but through precision. His figures never needed correcting. His memory was terrifying. He could recall wagers placed 6 weeks prior, down to the decimal, without checking his notes. The streets respected power, but they feared memory more. It was in that world that he met Benjamin Siegel. Where Lansky was cold, Bugsy was fire. Where Lansky thought, Bugsy struck. Their bond, born in the backlots of Manhattan and the smoke of teenage bootlegging deals, was unlikely, but absolute. Meyer had the plan. Bugsy had the teeth. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer mob. A 2-man operation that grew fast and without apology. They hijacked trucks, robbed bookies, and beat down extortionists who preyed on Jewish shopkeepers. Lansky didn't smile much, but when he did, people leaned in, because it meant something. They operated like no one else on the street. Lansky refused sloppy jobs. No loose ends. No freelancing. Every job was calculated. Time, risk, cost, return. They weren't just gangsters. They were surgeons. Meyer had a code. He didn't kill for sport, didn't touch women or children, didn't flaunt money. He once told a younger associate, "Any man who flashes his wallet is asking to be remembered, and that's not always a good thing." He lived by quiet control, a wallet stitched tight, a jacket pressed clean, shoes never scuffed. His enemies never saw him coming, and if they did, they rarely saw him twice. Prohibition gave them their first real foothold. Liquor moved fast through New York, and Meyer figured out how to make it move faster, cleaner, cheaper. While other crews fought over speakeasies and drowned in blood, Lansky focused on logistics. He built routes, mapped tunnels, bribed dock workers and cops alike. He forged ties with Irish crews in Hell's Kitchen, Italians in Little Italy. And while others were still stuck in turf wars, Lansky was building something else, a network. In the early 1930s, he sat down with Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a man with vision equal to his own. Together, they discussed what the old world dons could never understand: that crime could be organized, that families didn't have to fight, that empires could be negotiated. Lansky didn't want chaos, he wanted continuity. The National Crime Syndicate was born not with a bang, but a handshake, and Meyer became its architect. He never wore the title of boss. He didn't need it. While others took oaths, wore rings, kissed hands, and posed for newspapers, Meyer stayed behind the curtain, watching the ledgers, pulling strings. He set up dummy corporations to buy real estate, hid cash in Swiss accounts before anyone else thought to, bought laundromats, garages, pawn shops, any place where money changed hands and questions didn't get asked. He once said, "You can steal $1 with a knife, or you can steal 1,000,000 with a pencil." Meyer preferred the pencil. By the mid-1930s, his reach was vast, but still quiet. He owned pieces of casinos in Miami, hotels in Havana, wire services that fed race results to every bookie east of the Mississippi. He bankrolled union leaders, fixed court cases, and had judges in his ledger like old receipts. But you'd never know it to look at him. He didn't drive flash, didn't eat in public more than he had to. Lived in a modest home in Scarsdale with his wife and 3 kids. To the IRS, he was a retired investor. To the underworld, he was the safest bet alive. And yet, for all the power, all the money, Meyer carried something heavier than gold: memory. He never forgot where he came from, the anti-Semitism that chased him across an ocean, the names he saw carved into synagogue doors with knives, the way his accent once earned him beatings on the walk home from school. He hated bullies, hated seeing his people exploited. And when Nazi rallies began popping up in America in the late 1930s, Meyer did something few expected. He went to war. He formed what came to be known as the Minutemen, a loosely organized group of Jewish gangsters who hunted down American Nazis at rallies and beat them unconscious in alleyways. They didn't kill, just sent messages. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't forget who remembers. He didn't talk about it afterward, didn't mention it in court, never bragged. It was just something that had to be done. And then he returned to the ledgers. When Bugsy went west, Meyer didn't follow. Not physically, but he watched, funded, advised. He believed in Bugsy, not because of the flamingo or the desert dreams, but because Bugsy had always been a fire Meyer could never light himself. Still, as the costs mounted and the walls started to crack, Meyer pulled back. He tried to talk Bugsy down, tried to keep him from becoming a name on a list. But Bugsy wouldn't listen, and Meyer couldn't stop what was already in motion. After Siegel's murder in 1947, Meyer didn't attend the funeral, but he paid for it, sent flowers, covered the grave fees, closed the books on their last deal, and for the rest of his life, he never once publicly mentioned Bugsy's name again. Because grief for Meyer Lansky was not for show. It was for remembering. He once told a journalist, years later, "I've outlived them all. Luciano, Siegel, Costello, the cops, the judges, the headlines, all of them." He didn't say it with pride, just fact. Meyer Lansky had survived not because he was the smartest, though he might have been, but because he understood what none of the others did. That legacy is written not in blood, but in balance sheets. In a smoke-filled suite at the Waldorf Astoria, a group of men gathered around a table set with coffee, Cuban cigars, and silence. It was 1931, and the city outside rattled with the sound of boot heels and brass elevators. But inside that room, nothing moved unless Meyer Lansky wanted it to. There were no minutes taken, no contracts signed, just nods, glances, and the quiet murmur of names that would go on to rewrite the American underworld. Charles Lucky Luciano was there. So was Frank Costello. Al Capone had sent a representative from Chicago. The Jewish contingent was smaller in number, but formidable in calculation. Lansky, the architect, and his close confidant, Benjamin Siegel, still young, still fire-eyed, still dangerous. The meeting wasn't about guns, it wasn't about turf, it was about structure. Lansky had an idea, a way to stop the endless bloodshed and turn chaos into currency, a way to build a nation from rackets and risk. They called it the Commission, but behind the scenes, it was something more. It was the blueprint of a criminal empire. Meyer Lansky never cared for titles. He let others be kingpins, dons, bosses. He preferred numbers, margins, projections. While Capone courted photographers and Luciano cultivated charisma, Lansky slipped quietly into power and never once raised his voice to claim it. He once said, "You can keep the glory, I'll take the results." And he meant it. By the early 1930s, Lansky had helped orchestrate a merger unlike anything in American history. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Cuban crime syndicates were brought under one invisible roof, unified not by loyalty, but by profit. The old world rules, blood oaths, sacred codes, ethnic tribalism, were replaced by balance sheets and percentages. Every operation had a cut, every city a controller. Violence became surgical, retribution bureaucratic, and behind it all, Meyer Lansky moved the money. His genius wasn't just in forming alliances, it was in making crime sustainable. He pioneered the art of laundering before the term even existed. He set up real estate fronts in Miami, used dry cleaners and diners to cycle cash through layers of legitimacy. He sent trusted couriers overseas, to Geneva, Zurich, Luxembourg, to open anonymous bank accounts protected by European privacy laws. When law enforcement came knocking, they found nothing. No assets, no signatures, no trails. Lansky knew that in America, paper left fingerprints, so he used none. He was quiet in everything he did. He didn't drink, never smoked, rarely raised his voice. He met people in diners and parks, not penthouses. He wore modest suits, usually grey or navy, and always pressed. His cars were clean, his homes unremarkable, his habits surgical. While Siegel threw lavish parties and Luciano kept court in Harlem nightclubs, Lansky went home to his wife and 3 children. To his neighbors, he was an investor, a real estate man, an old immigrant with good manners and impeccable memory. Only a handful knew the truth, that he controlled operations stretching from New York to Havana, from Tampa to Kansas City, from the Catskills to Tel Aviv, and that when he whispered, men listened. He was the one who brokered peace between Luciano and Capone when their bootlegging empires clashed. He arranged sit-downs between Jewish and Italian bosses who otherwise would have slit each other's throats. He studied people the way other men studied markets, learning their fears, their tells, their tolerances. He could sit through an entire conversation and speak only once, and still leave the room with more power than when he entered. The other bosses respected him. They also feared him, because he never forgot a number, and never forgave a breach. In 1934, he helped restructure the Havana gambling network. The Batista regime in Cuba needed money. The American mob needed a safe haven. Lansky provided both. He paid off ministers, rewrote casino laws, and installed syndicate men in hotels like the Nacional and the Riviera. He built vaults in basement walls and wired roulette wheels to cheat without blinking. He made millions, but no one saw his name on any deed. That was the magic of it. He was there, in every light bulb, every dice roll, every bottle of champagne that hit the Cuban floor, but never in the photographs. And unlike many of his associates, Lansky didn't crave visibility. He craved longevity. He saw what happened to men who moved too loud, too fast. Arnold Rothstein, shot in a back room over a card debt. Dutch Schultz, gunned down in a Newark tavern. Even Luciano eventually had to flee. But Meyer stayed, quiet, precise, unbothered. He made investments in foreign exchange markets before anyone in organized crime could spell them. He hired accountants with Ivy League degrees, lawyers who taught at Columbia. He studied tax loopholes. When Congress passed the Bank Secrecy Act, Lansky had already moved his operations abroad. He was always ahead, always somewhere else. And yet, for all the intelligence, For all the poise, he never forgot where he came from. In private, he spoke Yiddish with his family. He donated anonymously to Jewish charities, funded schools, and paid the hospital bills of old friends from the Lower East Side. He kept photographs of his parents in the hallway of his Florida home, beside a mezuzah worn from decades of thumbprints. He had no illusions about the life he lived, but he never pretended it wasn't personal. FBI files on Lansky began stacking in the late 1930s, but every time the Bureau thought they had him, paper trail disappeared. Testimonies dissolved. Bank records led nowhere. He didn't threaten witnesses. He erased reasons to testify. To the public, he was a ghost with an accountant's handwriting. To the government, he was the white whale, always visible, never touchable. A former IRS agent once said, "Lansky was a phantom. His money moved, but he never did. We watched every house, every car, every phone. We got nothing." That was Lansky's masterpiece. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a system. In 1940, he turned down a deal that would have made him the visible head of the entire syndicate. He refused. He preferred the silence. "I don't need to be boss," he said once. "I need to be safe." That was the difference. Others played for power. He played for time. And time, more than anything else, became his advantage. He lived through the Prohibition era, the rise and fall of the Mafia's first wave, 2 world wars, and 5 presidential administrations. He outlasted Luciano, outlasted Siegel, outlasted Capone. While the world shifted and burned, Meyer Lansky kept counting. He died knowing that every dollar he'd ever earned, or moved, had been accounted for. That every man who underestimated him was either in prison or under stone. That the empire he helped build never bore his name. And that was exactly how he'd wanted it. The air in Havana at midnight was thick with rum and jazz. Palm trees swayed above the Malecon as Cadillac headlights cut across the water's edge. Couples danced beneath string lights strung between buildings that hadn't changed since the Spanish ruled them. And somewhere, in a suite overlooking the city, Meyer Lansky stared down at his empire with a glass of club soda and a list of numbers in his lap. This wasn't Las Vegas. Not yet. But to Meyer, it was better. Because unlike Vegas, where the heat came with scrutiny and every deal was a negotiation, Havana welcomed him with open arms and no questions. And for a man who had spent most of his life building power from the shadows, that kind of invitation was irresistible. It began in 1933, in the quiet aftermath of a failed revolution. The dictator, Gerardo Machado, had been overthrown, and a new figure, Fulgencio Batista, was clawing his way to the top. He was military, ambitious, and poor. Lansky understood men like that. He made introductions, extended offers, promised funding in exchange for favors. And when Batista finally seized control for good in 1952, the doors were wide open. American businessmen couldn't move money into Cuba fast enough. Real estate deals, casino licenses, sugar exports, shipping contracts. Everything was for sale, and Lansky was already sitting at the table. By 1955, Meyer Lansky had transformed Havana into the syndicate's crown jewel. Casinos lined the streets of Vedado and Miramar like cathedrals. The Riviera, the Tropicana, the Capri, the Sans Souci. But none of them rivaled the one Lansky kept closest to his chest, the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. Built in 1930, perched atop a hill with views stretching out to the sea, the Nacional was already a monument of elegance. But under Lansky's guidance, it became something else. A temple of vice dressed in velvet. He oversaw its redesign himself, imported Italian chandeliers, installed private gaming salons with gold-trimmed tables, paid entertainers double their Vegas rates. Mob money poured in from Chicago, Miami, Kansas City, Cleveland. And Lansky, he didn't just make the deals, he balanced every dollar. Every night, as the roulette wheels spun and the mambo shook the walls, Meyer sat quietly in a room 1 floor above, adjusting ledgers and wiring profits to Swiss accounts no one else could trace. He cut Batista in generously. The dictator received a fixed percentage from every casino, every club, every backroom table. Batista didn't ask how the cash was made, only when it would arrive. Lansky obliged, always on time, always exact. In return, he got what mattered most to him, protection and freedom. The American government knew. They sent agents, filed reports, but they were always a step too late, always just shy of jurisdiction. To US law enforcement, Lansky was a tourist. a retiree, a man enjoying the Cuban weather and the luxury suites that came with it. But behind every door, behind every curtain, he was orchestrating an economy. The National's guest book read like a dream. Frank Sinatra, Ava Gardner, Nat King Cole, Marlon Brando. Even Winston Churchill visited once. It was the glamour that sold the illusion. Lansky understood that. He didn't need Havana to be loud. He needed it to be beautiful. Because beauty distracted. Beauty silenced questions. And while the cameras lingered on the dancers, the real business stayed invisible. He held meetings in the garden courtyard. Deals made over espresso and pastelitos. He negotiated with capos under ceiling fans spinning like lazy vultures. He rewarded loyalty with profit sharing and punished betrayal with permanent exile. He didn't raise his voice, didn't carry a weapon, but no one crossed him. Not in Havana, not anywhere. By 1958, Lansky's empire in Cuba was valued at over $300 million. The syndicate was thriving, Vegas was expanding, and Havana, under his control, had become the golden faucet that kept it all flowing. But something was moving in the mountains, something that couldn't be bribed. Fidel Castro had been a name on reports since the early 1950s, a revolutionary, a nuisance, someone the government swore was under control. Lansky kept his distance, watched, waited. He didn't like chaos. Chaos made books unpredictable, and Castro was chaos. As the rebels pushed into the countryside, Lansky tried to prepare. He moved some money out, liquidated a few accounts, quietly sold off smaller assets. But the casinos, the Nacional, he didn't touch them. He believed Havana was untouchable. On New Year's Eve, 1958, the National's ballroom glittered with champagne and dancers. Sinatra was on stage. Batista was still in power. Lansky, now in his mid-50s, sat at his usual table near the back. Tailored suit, clean hands, watching everything. Just before midnight, he stepped outside for a walk on the veranda. The breeze was warm, the sea calm. But in the hills outside the city, rebels had already seized government stations. By dawn, Batista was gone, fled to the Dominican Republic with what money he could carry. And everything Meyer Lansky had built vanished overnight. In a single week, Castro's new government nationalized the casinos, shut down the banks, seized the hotels. They called it justice. Lansky called it theft. His accounts were frozen, his papers seized, his name erased from every agreement. Guards with rifles stood outside the Nacional. Dancers disappeared. The roulette wheels stopped spinning. Havana went dark. He boarded a flight to Miami with a single suitcase and $200 in cash. No headlines. No goodbye. The man who had turned a nation into a counting room left like a refugee. And yet, even then, he didn't rage. He didn't retaliate. He regrouped. In Miami, he stayed quiet. Rented a small house near Collins Avenue. The government wanted him indicted. The FBI compiled thick files. Prosecutors whispered about tax evasion and foreign currency fraud. But they could never pin him. The money had been moved. The shell companies dissolved. The witnesses didn't exist. In later interviews, Lansky was asked about Havana. He didn't say much. But once, just once, he offered a line that lingered. They didn't beat me. I just lost the house. To the syndicate, Cuba had been more than income. It was stability. Without it, operations elsewhere started to fray. The feds cracked down harder. Vegas drew more attention. Politicians changed. The world Lansky had built, a world of handshakes and offshore deposits, began to erode. And the man behind it all watched, in silence, from a folding chair in his Florida kitchen. He had survived wars, betrayals, investigations. But in the end, it wasn't bullets or prison that cost him his empire. It was a revolution, a single tide that swept through with no warning and no room for negotiation. Still, he adapted, sold what was left, moved cash through channels no one else could find. And even in his 60s, he remained a player, silent, sharp, dangerous. He wasn't the king anymore, but he still held the keys to doors people didn't know existed. The Hotel Nacional still stands. It's a museum now, a place of history and ghost stories. Tourists take photos in the ballroom where Sinatra sang. They walk the gardens where mob deals were inked over guava pastries. Most don't know that behind those walls, a man once built a financial machine so complex, it survived even after he didn't. They don't know about the ledgers, the vaults, the plans. They don't know about the man who ran it all without needing a crown. Only the silence. The lights of Las Vegas could be seen from 30 miles out, flickering in the desert like a hallucination that refused to fade. By the time most people arrived in the city, it already felt like something larger than itself. Casinos carved out of sand, fountains bubbling in the middle of nowhere, card tables that seemed older than the state line. They saw Bugsy Siegel in the pink neon. They saw Sinatra in the showrooms. They saw towers rise from dry earth and called it American magic. What they didn't see, what they never saw, was Meyer Lansky, because that was exactly how he wanted it. Lansky had understood Las Vegas long before it sparkled. Even in the early 1930s, when it was just a dusty junction of railroad workers and brothels, he recognized its potential. Nevada's legislature had legalized gambling in 1931, hoping to keep Depression-era revenue from crumbling entirely. While politicians saw desperation, Lansky saw opportunity. A city where gambling was legal, where money could be moved through official channels and skimmed on the way out. It wasn't just a dream, it was a machine waiting for an operator. But Meyer was never the type to announce his plans. He sent men instead. Bugsy Siegel became the face, the charm, the show. He had the look, the movie star profile, the taste for flash. He talked about Vegas like it was a film set, a place where suits would never wrinkle and every card was a winning hand. Meyer didn't interfere. He let Bugsy run, but he controlled the stream beneath the surface. He advised on the land purchases, made sure the suppliers were union approved, connected the contractors to men who wouldn't ask why a cement shipment came in heavier than billed. He sat with the bankers, the lawyers, the silent partners. He was never on the paperwork, but his name echoed in every ledger. When the Flamingos stumbled in 1946, Meyer wasn't surprised. Bugsy had gone too far, overbuilt, overspent, overpromised. Still, he didn't cut him loose right away. He believed in loyalty, but only to a point. When the numbers stopped adding up, when the whispers from New York turned to threats, he didn't stop them, because the dream mattered more than the dreamer. Bugsy's fall wasn't the end of Lansky's vision. It was the beginning of control. After Siegel's murder, Lansky moved quickly and quietly. He placed trusted men in key positions, gave orders that came disguised as advice, suggested floor managers, pit bosses, security teams, all men with thick necks and sealed mouths. He sent Chicago muscle to back the skim and East Coast accountants to track the flow. Every dollar that passed through the cashier's cage was counted 3 times, once for the customer, once for the state, and once for Lansky's silent empire. He didn't need ownership. He needed leverage, and he got it. The casinos multiplied. El Rancho, the Sahara, the Riviera, the Sands, each built with money that had no clear origin. Each run by frontmen, respectable, smiling executives who smiled for the cameras and never once asked why certain rooms were locked after hours. Lansky was behind all of them, in one way or another. He set the rules. Skimming was expected, but only the right amount. Employees were to be paid well, but never empowered. Unions were to be bought before they made demands. Politicians were to be courted. Journalists ignored or paid. The system ran like a watch wound by invisible hands, and Meyer held the key. He didn't visit often. A flight here, a hotel suite there. He never sat at the tables, never drank with the bosses. But when he walked through a casino, everyone noticed. He'd nod to a floorman, stop to talk to a doorman's nephew, ask about the weather, the traffic, the take from last night's craps pit. He already knew the numbers. He was just checking the people. Behind closed doors, Meyer ran the Vegas map like a general planning troop movements. He separated territories by influence. Chicago got the Sands, Cleveland the Desert Inn, Miami a piece of the Tropicana. If conflicts arose, he mediated. Not with threats, with math. This is what they made last quarter. This is what you made. Now shake hands. And they did. Because no one wanted to fight the only man who never blinked. The government tried to catch him. Senate committees, tax audits, surveillance teams. But Meyer was always a half step away. No assets in his name. No voice on the wiretaps. No receipts he hadn't burned twice. He let others take the stage. Guys like Mo Delitz, Frank Rosenthal, even the occasional actor who thought running a casino was like playing one in a movie. He stayed in the wings, counting. In 1958, the Gaming Control Board was created, Nevada's attempt to legitimize the industry it had birthed. Lansky had already seen it coming. He coached his men on licensing requirements, made sure everyone's stories matched, set up holding companies to distance himself from daily operations. While others scrambled to hide, he'd already faded. They never found enough to charge him, because Meyer never kept anything he couldn't walk away from. He loved Vegas, but he didn't trust it. Too many eyes, too many microphones, too many men who thought they could rewrite the script. By the 1960s, he began pulling back, not because he'd lost interest, but because he had learned long ago that every empire burns eventually. He began shifting investments into land in Florida, holding companies in the Bahamas, resort developments in Central America. He let others worry about headlines. He stayed focused on balance sheets. Lansky never received credit for building Las Vegas. He never wanted it. That was the brilliance. While others were immortalized in neon and scandal, he remained a rumor, a whisper behind a vault door. He was the reason Vegas worked, the reason it didn't collapse under its own weight. He was the stability that Vice requires, the silence beneath the music. In later years, when reporters asked if he regretted not taking a public role, he just shrugged. "Public's for actors," he said. "I was never acting." And when the casinos started to change, when corporations moved in and the mob influence began to dry up, Meyer didn't protest. He'd already gotten what he came for. He'd built an empire. Then he'd let others stand in its light. By the time the United States government decided to make Meyer Lansky a priority, he was already fading, not from power, but from visibility. It was the late 1960s, and the empire he had helped build now cast shadows too large to ignore. The casinos, the unions, the offshore accounts. His name rarely appeared on paper, but it hovered like smoke over every table where money disappeared. J. Edgar Hoover had once pretended the mafia didn't exist. Now he wanted trophies. And Lansky, quiet, ghost-like Lansky, had become the perfect one. They didn't want to catch him in a murder. That was never his crime. They wanted him on taxes, on numbers, on lines of ink that didn't add up. The indictment came in 1970. Federal prosecutors accused him of skimming millions from the Flamingo and laundering it through Swiss accounts. The paper trail was thin, but the headlines were loud. Lansky didn't wait for the trial. He packed a small suitcase, kissed his wife goodbye, and boarded a plane to Tel Aviv. At 70 years old, he looked like a retiree heading home. Because in a way, he was. Israel had always called to him, not for faith, but for history, for safety. Under the law of return, any Jew could seek asylum. Lansky had believed that law would protect him, that the nation born from exile would grant him shelter. And for a while, it did. He settled in Herzliya, a quiet beach town north of Tel Aviv. He walked each morning, read American newspapers in cafes, smiled for a few reporters who flew in hoping for a scoop. When asked about the charges back in the US, he would simply say, "I'm an old man, let me rest." But rest would not come. The American government pressured Israeli authorities relentlessly. They called him a fugitive, a fraud. They said harboring him was harboring organized crime itself. Israel bent. The Minister of the Interior, under diplomatic pressure, ruled that Lansky did not qualify for citizenship, that his record in the United States disqualified him from the protections of the law of return. It was the only known time the law had ever been denied to a Jew without a criminal conviction. He was put on a plane, returned like cargo. When Lansky landed in Miami, US Marshals were waiting, but so was his lawyer. He was arraigned, released on bond, and when the trial began, prosecutors felt confident. They had transcripts, informants, bank flags. But Lansky had time on his side, and memory. Witnesses vanished. Others changed their stories. One suffered a sudden stroke before testifying. Documents disappeared. It was as if the evidence had been stored in a room no one could enter, and the key thrown into the ocean. The courtroom felt less like a legal proceeding, and more like a quiet surrender. The case collapsed. Lansky was acquitted. Again. But something had changed. Not in his record, in his body. By now he walked with a cane. His hands shook slightly when he reached for his glasses. He spoke slower, slept longer. Doctors confirmed what he had suspected in Israel: lung cancer. The kind that waits in silence for years before taking everything at once. It didn't matter that he'd never spent a day in prison. His body had become one. In his final years, Lansky kept to a small condo in Miami Beach. The same city where he once ran bootlegging routes now watched him shuffle along the boardwalk, a tired figure in a fedora and oversized sunglasses. The press still followed sometimes. They asked him if he regretted anything, if he missed Vegas, if he feared dying alone. He rarely answered. When he did, it was clipped. "I beat them," he once told a reporter from the Miami Herald. "That's enough." But his eyes told a different story. Less triumph, more distance, as if part of him was already gone. The FBI never gave up completely. Files were opened and reopened. Agents followed his grandchildren to school. Phone lines were tapped. Garbage sifted. They never found what they wanted. Because Lansky didn't need to hide secrets anymore. He had become one. The man who had once counted millions by hand now counted steps to the kitchen, counted pills, counted visits from his grandson. But he never stopped reading the financial section, never stopped calculating. His mind stayed sharp, even as the rest dimmed. Meyer Lansky died on January 15th, 1983. No gold, no empire. Just a modest apartment and a checking account with less than $60,000. The government had spent decades chasing a fortune they could never find. Some say it was hidden, others say it never existed. But those close to him knew better. The real empire had never been in banks. It was in systems, in men who still ran casinos, still skimmed quietly, still paid respect to a ghost. They buried him in Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami. No grand procession, no flowers from Vegas, just a name on stone and silence. Because when the dust settled, when the headlines moved on, what remained was a truth only Meyer Lansky had understood. Power fades. Legends get rewritten. But the man who knows everything, if he stays quiet, outlasts them all. On a cloudless January morning in 1983, a modest procession made its way through Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami. There were no limousines, no fanfare, no flood of floral tributes, just a few sedans, a handful of mourners, and a pine casket that carried the last breath of one of the most powerful men in American criminal history. Meyer Lansky was dead. He had passed quietly in a hospital room on Collins Avenue, the heart finally giving way after years of decline. No media circus awaited his last words, because there were none. No memoirs, no grand confessions, just silence. The man who had once moved millions through Havana's casinos, who'd sat with Batista, Bugsy, Luciano, died with a checking account that barely skimmed 50 grand. And yet, somewhere in Washington, someone at the IRS still listed his net worth at over $300 million. The mystery didn't end with his death. If anything, it deepened. He had no lavish estate, no vaults, no written accounts of offshore holdings. His children inherited little more than old photos, coded letters, and a family name still whispered in courtrooms and precincts. Friends, those few who remain, said Lansky had always prepared for this. He lived by the rule: never let them find you when you're alive, and never let them remember you when you're gone. The funeral reflected that principle. Fewer than a dozen stood graveside. Most of the old guard, Luciano, Genovese, Siegel, Accardo, were already dust. The rest were hiding, imprisoned, or pretending they'd never known the man now beneath the earth. A rabbi read a brief psalm. Lansky's wife stood silent, face veiled, refusing to speak to the press. His grandson placed a folded piece of paper on the casket. No one ever said what it said. The pine box lowered slowly. A spade struck dirt. And that was it. The newspapers gave him a page 3 obituary. Alleged mob financier dies in Florida. No honorifics, no grudging praise. The world had moved on from Meyer Lansky, or at least it thought it had. But traces remained. In Las Vegas, hotel owners still skimmed. In Miami, shell companies bore his invisible watermark. In Tel Aviv, an unclaimed condo remained untouched, blinds drawn, dishes still stacked from breakfast. The myth of Meyer Lansky had been burned down to its embers, but the systems he built, the quiet, disciplined architecture of underworld finance, continued humming long after the architect was buried. There was something deliberate in the way he exited history. No last interviews, no memoirs, no attempts to rewrite the record, because Lansky didn't believe in explaining power. He believed in wielding it, quietly, precisely, like a scalpel, not a gun. To some, that made him forgettable. To others, it made him immortal. The FBI never closed his file, not fully. Even in death, the Bureau sent agents to his funeral. They watched, took photos, made notes. But they found nothing. No whispers, no signals, no sudden inheritance. Just a quiet man lowered into a quiet grave. In the decades that followed, his legend shifted like smoke. Some called him the true king of Las Vegas. Others said he was just an accountant, overrated, hiding behind real muscle. But those who knew the circuits of power, who understood how money moves behind curtains, knew better. Meyer Lansky had once made presidents look away, had orchestrated empires through backroom deals and buried ledgers. And when it came time to die, he did so like he had lived, undetected. He outlived nearly all of them, not just the gangsters, but the stories. And in the end, the silence was his final revenge. Because you can't indict silence. You can't subpoena absence. You can't kill a ghost that never left a shadow. In Las Vegas, the neon never sleeps. It blinks and pulses like a memory refusing to fade. Reds, blues, golds, all humming in unison like a chorus of electric ghosts. Beneath the lights, the stories still echo. Names once whispered in cigar smoke and backroom deals now drift through slot machines and cocktail lounges. Their owners long buried, but never quite gone. Two names, Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. Brooklyn boys, immigrant sons. Two sides of a coin minted in poverty and ambition. Bugsy, the mirror. Meyer, the ledger. Bugsy loved the flash, the suits, the women, the front page headlines. A man who walked like a movie script, lived like the third act, and died like a plot twist. Meyer loved silence. He loved numbers that told no tales and contracts that never needed signatures. He believed in permanence, not applause. Together, they didn't just work the angles, they changed the game. They met young, both children of Jewish immigrants scraping by in the tenements of Brownsville. The world gave them little, so they took what they needed. Pickpocket tricks gave way to extortion. Extortion led to enforcement. Enforcement became enterprise. Bugsy carried the blade, Meyer carried the map. By the 1920s, they were young princes of a rising underworld. They watched the Italians consolidate, the Irish fracture, and saw an opening. A chance to build something bigger than ethnic boundaries or borough turf wars. Something national, something permanent. With Luciano's blessing and Lansky's quiet strategy, the National Crime Syndicate was born. A table where Jews, Italians, and Irish could sit together, as long as the money flowed and the rules were kept. Bugsy enforced those rules with bullets. Meyer enforced them with numbers, buried inside numbers, inside shell companies the government could never quite reach. But it was Las Vegas that would become their altar. A desert nowhere, waiting to be rewritten in gold. Bugsy saw it first, or claimed to. The Flamingo, a palace in the sand. He poured millions into it, more than the syndicate wanted, more than common sense allowed. He wanted a haven for Hollywood royalty and wise guys in tailored tuxedos. But he lost control of the budget, and worse, the trust of the men back east. They found him in Beverly Hills, June 20th, 1947. 9 bullets through the window pane. One took out his eye. The mirror finally cracked. Meyer didn't attend the funeral. He didn't make statements, didn't light a candle or place a rose. Because Meyer understood there were no martyrs in the underworld, only liabilities. And sometimes, love meant letting someone go before they took you with them. Still, the dream didn't die with Bugsy. Lansky saw to that. He helped rewrite the casino model, created the skim, where money was taken off the top before it ever touched the books. He worked with union bosses, frontmen, state regulators. He made sure casinos looked legitimate while paying tribute to men who never signed anything, never showed their faces. The lights grew brighter, the buildings taller, the shows louder. But at the foundation was a man who never wanted to be seen. He owned nothing on paper, but everything in truth. They were never the same again after Bugsy's death. Not Meyer, not the syndicate. Something had shifted. The boys from Brownsville had built an empire, but empires demand sacrifice, and Las Vegas had claimed one of its kings. Meyer grew quieter in the years that followed. He stopped attending large dinners, avoided the spotlight. When asked about Siegel, he offered only 5 words. He made too many enemies. But but those close to him said he never stopped mourning. Not because of the death, but because of what it meant. Because even gods of the underworld must watch their temples crack. And still, the neon burns. The flamingo is still there, rebuilt, repackaged, rebranded. But if you walk the north end, under the pink glow, you'll find a bronze plaque that bears the name Bugsy Siegel. It's sanitized, tourist-friendly, a nod to myth. No plaque bears Lansky's name. He preferred it that way, but his fingerprint is everywhere. In the vaults, in the margins, in the unspoken codes that still govern who gets what and when. They were men of their time, and yet timeless in their consequences. 2 boys from Brooklyn, one who wanted to be seen, one who insisted on disappearing. Bugsy died at 41, frozen in time like a candle snuffed out before midnight. Lansky died at 80 in a rented Miami apartment, beneath a name that once terrified senators and moved judges into silence. The gangster with mirrors and the gangster with numbers. One died with headlines, the other with a whisper. But between them, they carved their names into the marrow of American history. Vegas never forgot. It just replaced the faces. Now the streets are lit by algorithms and boardroom contracts. But somewhere, beneath the concrete and coin machines, beneath the blinking jackpot signs and velvet ropes, something of Bugsy remains. Something of Meyer. Not flesh, not fortune, just design. Because what they built was more than a business. It was a myth. A structure in neon, in shadows, in whispered memory. And even when the men are long gone, the light remembers.